Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on ocean wave energy in Australia. My name is Professor Irene Pennesis, and I'm the Research Director in the Blue Economy CRC. On behalf of the Blue Economy CRC, I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we're hosting this webinar today and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and as to emerging leaders as well. I extend that respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. The Blue Economy CRC was established 5 years ago now in 2019 by the Australian Government CRC program. We've got 43 participants in the Blue Economy CRC, and Leslie can just showing them up on your screen now. We've got people from, across Australia and around the globe that are participating in the CRC, and we've been really brought together to perform world-class collaborative industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of the blue economy, and really through increased offshore sustainable aquaculture or seafood and marine production, and also renewable energy production as well. I'm really excited about today's webinar. I mean, obviously wave energy is pretty dear to my heart in terms of my background in research, but today we've got the privilege of hearing from experts behind the report that we released this year on Australia's wave energy potential. And we actually launched it at the International Conference on Ocean Energy in September in Melbourne this year. So it's an opportunity for us really, since producing this report, to bring it to many others who are interested in developments in wave energy as well. So I just wanted to kind of say that, in 2021, the Blue Economy CRC released a groundbreaking offshore wind energy in Australia report, which played a really pivotal role in jumpstarting Australia's offshore wind industry. Hence, we really believe that it was crucial that we create a similar report for wave energy in Australia to help catalyse industrial growth and the opportunities presented by our unique wave climate. And of course, as a CRC, with our partners, we've been contributing to the development of wave energy now since the beginning of the CRC. And this year really marked an important milestone for us with two key trials of projects in the water. We had our moored multi-mode, multi-body M4 wave energy converter led by the University of Western Australia and Marine Energy Research Australia. That device was launched, or the project was launched in September 24, and the device was deployed and has been operating in the King George Sound in Albany now since October sometime. And it will be in the water for quite some time. So if you're heading over to Western Australia, please go out to the Whaling Centre and check out the device in the water there. We've also had this year, in the first half of 2024, in the waters off Fremantle, WA, we had a project led by Carnegie Clean Energy called the More Power Technology Project, and that was utilising Carnegie's CETO-derived wave technology for offshore aquaculture applications where we could use wave energy instead of relying on diesel for offshore aquaculture operations. And that had a very successful deployment and operation in Fremantle at the start of this year. And a lot of that information is found on our website. So today, it's a pretty interesting report, and you're going to hear from all the lead authors that covered a range of these topics that are being presented. So just to briefly introduce to you the people who will be speaking today: Dr. Hugh Wolgamott from Marine Energy Research Australia and the University of Western Australia. And when I introduced the UWA speakers, they actually led this report in collaboration with many other partners who I'll introduce in a minute. Adi Kunawarian from Marine Energy Research Australia and the University of Western Australia, Dr. Yana Ozogova from the Blue Economy CRC, one of our program leaders in offshore renewable energy, and also the University of Western Australia, Dr. Natalia Sergienko from the University of Adelaide, Dr. Wipke Ebling from the University of Western Australia and Marine Energy Research Australia, Dr. Rowan Trebelko from CSIRO, Dr. Philip Marsh from the University of Tasmania Australian Maritime College, Dr. Hugh Breakey from Griffith University, and Pethy Lyons from CSIRO, and Peter Osman from CSIRO. So I'm really excited for these experts to be talking about the findings in this report that we released. You can see that there's a little barcode to help you actually access the report, but also for this webinar. But if I move to the next slide, I'll just introduce to you what our speakers are going to be talking to us about today. They're going to be covering basically the key summary and recommendations from the report. And I suppose they're probably the key findings for us about the research that we've completed. Looking at the international trends and developments, a study around Australia's ocean wave resource, the market opportunities, application and integration with other forms of renewables, developing a wave energy industry, and also the environmental, social and cultural aspects. So if we move to the next slide, you can see that in fact, there's been a number of organisations that have actually been involved in supporting this research funded by the Blue Economy, led by the University of Western Australia, but we've got CSIRO, Griffith University, Swinburne, the University of Adelaide, the University of Tasmania, Carnegie Clean Energy, Waveswell, BMT. And we've had 3 other international partners who have played a critical role, as well as many others who have reviewed this report as well, the University of Edinburgh, the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust and Aquaterra. So we really appreciate everybody's contributions to the research that's been presented in this report. Next slide, please, Leslie. And so if you want to grab a copy of the report, you can either go straight to the Blue Economy CRC's website, or you can quickly try and scan this code on your screen to go directly to that location. And you can also find the link where the webinar was held today. So I'm going to get straight into really introducing you to the first speaker, and I'm going to welcome Hugh Wolgamott from the University of Western Australia. Thanks. Next slide, please, Leslie, to take us through the executive summary and recommendations. Thanks, Hugh.
Thanks, Irene. And thanks everyone for coming. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the summary of the report and then the recommendations, and the rest of the team will essentially back that up with the details coming up after the summary. So to start off with, Australia has the world's biggest national wave energy resource, and not just the biggest, but also probably the best in terms of certain characteristics, which we'll cover later. It's very persistent and relatively mild in terms of extremes. Next point. Wave energy, sometimes people talk about wave energy compared to other renewables, and that's perhaps the wrong framing. It's really about wave energy being complementary to other renewables, particularly to solar, so that it can play a key role in future grids. Wave energy, we have national targets to reach net zero, and wave energy can be a critical enabler, we find in this report, in helping us to achieve those targets, given our great resources and the role it can play. We have a great potential for wave energy to support our economy in terms of jobs and exports. So wave energy is an industry which is up for grabs, and Australia could grasp some of that opportunity and bring an industry here to support the economy. On the next point, wave energy is a bit different to other types of renewable energy in that it can have a dual function. So there's the possibility that wave energy converters can provide coastal protection at the same time as generating electricity, and there are interesting synergies to be studied there. The role of wave energy converters in coastal protection is something that has been looked at, but there's ongoing complexity in that area. Next point. There's a lot of experience now with offshore developments, and so there's a real opportunity for the wave energy sector as it develops to take the lead in new environmental, social and cultural approaches to ensure that we have, as a transition to net zero, a just transition to net zero, and that communities are brought along on that path. We also find in the report that at the moment, other regions are moving far ahead of Australia with large investments in wave energy. The US, for example, has been investing about $100 million a year over the last 5 years into wave energy, and we're not matching that. So at the moment, we're not keeping pace, so we don't have the level of support and strategic framework that would be needed to keep up with other jurisdictions based on where we sit at the moment. However, we don't see any barriers here. The great team that's been assembled to deliver this report shows what this community can do. And we find that rapid development of wave energy in Australia is possible, and actually the time to get going on that is now. So the report is really a call to action. So next slide, please. So the overall recommendation then is that federal and state governments in Australia should take a strategic view of the wave energy industry in order to achieve the maximum national benefit from this potentially critical national resource. And so that entails this broad view and to enable coordination through this national community and also from the national community to these international jurisdictions, including the International Energy Agency's Ocean Energy Systems, which has a roadmap out to 2050 for wave and tidal energy, and to try and link our efforts in with global efforts and to take a leading role. And it's about national benefit. And so in that space, we've made a number of recommendations in the report, drawing on the material from the chapters. And so the first couple of recommendations come under the heading of incorporating wave energy into national and state planning, so this sort of coordination piece. So the first recommendation is for ARENA to fund a study to determine what this national benefit could be for developing a wave energy industry, including benefits economic and social, benefits in sovereign capability, in environmental sustainability and export capacity, by developing a domestic industry which is truly world leading. The next recommendation under this point is then for AEMO to include in its integrated system plan possibilities for wave energy, and in particular to look at and evaluate the impact of wave energy on 2050 requirements for energy storage. We see that wave energy is a developing technology, but we have this 2050 horizon, and that the role that wave energy could play by that time can be particularly significant in terms of storage. The next recommendation under this national and state planning is that there's a sustainable ocean plan being developed at the moment, and wave energy should be considered alongside other renewable energy technologies in that plan. The second bucket of recommendations on the next slide are around funding wave energy in a way which is consistent and at large scale to de-risk and accelerate deployments. So we find that projects on different scales and across different applications should be funded to validate wave energy technology and to demonstrate its national benefits over longer periods. So one of the key benefits of wave energy is the sort of temporal persistence of its resource. And so to quantify this benefit, there's really a need for funding of projects which will be able to demonstrate those characteristics and to then enable better planning. And this is also well aligned with the technology push funding that the OES recommends. Then an integrated study to establish national guidelines for using wave energy for coastal protection should be carried out. So this is a complex problem in its technical, its social, its environmental and cultural aspects. As wave energy converters have this dual purpose for coastal protection, it's key that there's trust in the way that that could be done. And on the last bucket of recommendations around sharing non-competitive information. So we find that baseline data and data sharing across jurisdictions and collaborations and also on community engagement should be incentivized so that we can collaborate nationally and also learn from other industries. And then the final recommendation is to study the wave energy resource on the next point available at key hotspots, including the offshore wind declared zones in the Southern Ocean. Next point. And that these should be high resolution and enable key studies of key locations to be carried out. So those are the summary and recommendations of our report.
Thank you very much, Hugh. So there's a really good number of valuable insights, but also actionable recommendations for a range of stakeholders, actually, for the support and development of wave energy in Australia. We're going to turn now to Adi Kuniawan from the University of Western Australia. And Adi's going to take us through the findings from one of the first chapters, which is around the international trends and developments. So Adi, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene. So I'd like to first acknowledge my co-authors, Natalia and Philip, for their contributions, and also thank our reviewers for their helpful suggestions. Next slide, please. So this chapter aims to set a scene by first looking back so we may appreciate how far wave energy has gone, and then surveying the current international landscape, comparing that with the Australian landscape. Next, please. So wave energy has come a long way since the first patent was filed in 1799. Next, please. Detailed timeline with key milestones is presented in the report, but in summary, there are 3 turning points: the oil crisis in the 70s, the oil price decline in the 80s, and climate change awareness in the 90s. These turning points marked 4 episodes. Next, please. The first, limited activity before the 70s, and then a surge of innovation and discoveries spurred by the oil crisis, and then a sharp decline in activity from mid-80s to late 90s, thanks to falling oil prices. And finally, a revival in the years following 2000 amid growing concerns over the environmental impact of fossil fuels. Next, please. So wave energy has come, sorry, maybe skip the previous slide. Thanks. So wave energy has come a long way. Compared to other sources of energy, the principles of absorbing energy from the waves were discovered much later. Even so, we now know that a good wave energy absorber must be a good wave maker. We know how to maximize the power that a given device can absorb. It's not a rocket science, but as history has shown us, inconsistent funding environments have created gaps and slowed progress. So wave energy really needs a sustained long-term strategy. Next slide, please. So looking at what the world is doing, we see, at least in parts of the world, that such long-term vision exists. The EU, for example, is targeting 40 gigawatts of ocean energy by 2050. This includes wave and tidal, but excludes offshore wind. The EU's commitment to wave energy is demonstrated by various programs, the most notable one being Europe Wave, which is a competitive pre-commercial procurement program aiming to bring wave energy to commercial scale. This is set to be succeeded by the Prosper 2030 program. Next slide, please. And the United Kingdom has been playing a leading role in Europe. It is targeting 22 gigawatt of wave energy by 2050, and it has committed a significant amount of funding for wave energy, has a dedicated support structure in place, such as the Supergen Ore Hub, which is a nationwide consortium to support ocean energy research, and Wave Energy Scotland, established by the Scottish government. Next, please. And the US has ramped up its activities in recent years. Since 2019, it has committed over $100 million per year for ocean energy research, development, and innovation. In September this year, the US Department of Energy announced another $112 million for wave energy through the Water Power Technologies Office. Other avenues also exist, such as through the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And also there are various support mechanisms, such as through PRIMRE, which is a portal and repository for information on marine renewable energy, and TEMA, which provides expertise and access to testing facilities. Next, please. And closer to home, countries like China, Japan, and Korea are active. It might be worth highlighting here that China, who has a relatively small wave energy resource, has at least 2 sites for sea trials of devices, and is currently developing a national roadmap for ocean energy. Next slide, please. So what about Australia? Australia is a late player when it comes to the marine energy space, but has made important contributions with a number of sea trials in recent years, demonstrating its capabilities as a nation. However, comparing with what other countries are doing and the tremendous resource it has, we see a contrast. Of the total funding from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency since 2012, ocean energy projects constitute less than 2%. And at the moment, there are no dedicated roadmaps or dedicated funding schemes for ocean energy. Next, please. So we risk being left behind and missing great opportunities. Looking at the chart here, we see an encouraging trend in the increasing uptake of renewable energy, but whether wave energy will be part of this is the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. So that's a bit of a very comprehensive understanding of some of the international trends happening in wave energy. I'm now going to invite Jana Orzagova from University of Western Australia and Blue Economy CRC to really talk to us about what Australia's wave energy resource is and its potential. Thanks, Jana.
Thank you very much, Irene. All right, so chapter 3 of the report covers the Australian wave resource, and it was jointly written by Kathy Meckins from CSIRO, myself and Richard Manasseh from Swinburne University of Technology, and reviewed by a number of people from Australia. But before looking at Australia, next slide, please, Leslie. Let's have a look at the global overview. So here we've got the map of the mean wave energy flux measured in kilowatts per meter, and it really represents the rate at which energy is being transported by ocean waves through a meter of a wavefront. And in the Southern Ocean, we see a very energetic band. This is due to strong, consistent westerly winds and very limited land mass. And we see that the southern coast of Australia is exposed to these large Southern Ocean swell waves. And indeed, if we look at national overview, which we have on the right-hand side, Australia comes at the top of all countries in the world in terms of the wave resource. Next slide, please. So zooming in on Australian waters, this is the same sort of heat map of the wave energy flux, and we see that the southwest and southern coastline, as well as western coastline of Tasmania, have very energetic wave climate. In fact, if we looked at the overall wave energy on an annual basis, across the 200-meter depth contour, it turns out that it's 10 times as large as the annual national electricity generation. So the resource is truly enormous. And yes, there are losses as we go into shallower water due to wave breaking and bottom friction, but even in shallow water, which are more likely locations for deployment of wave energy converters, the resource is still very, very large. Next slide, please. So what do these waves look like and where do they come from? As we see on the map here, the one on the left-hand side, so the southwest and southern coastline is swell dominated, so long period waves, typical 11 seconds, shorter waves on the east coast, and the north coastline is dominated by locally generated wind seas, so typical very short 4-second waves. Now, the Southern Ocean swells come from the southwest, and then they have to sort of wrap around Tasmania, so the approach direction on the east coast is from the southeast. And of course, for wave energy converters, wave period is a critical parameter because they are designed to operate in resonance with the incoming waves. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of the characteristics up until now that I've shown you were sort of long-term averages. But we know that all of the wave climate characteristics, they vary in time, you know, from across seconds to sort of seasonal and decadal variations. So here we've got the seasonality of the Australian wave resource shown. And we see that we have lower wave energy input during the summertime and higher during winter time. Now, this ratio of winter to summer sort of wave energy input is roughly 2 to 1. Which actually in comparison to other global wave energy hotspots is really quite low. So even throughout the year, the wave climate is fairly consistent. And what I would also like to point out, as was already mentioned by Hugh, the complementarity of the seasonality of wave resource to the solar resource. So wave energy peaks when solar energy is low. Next slide, please. All right, I'd like to briefly talk about extremes because they are important. So when I say extremes, I mean large, sort of energetic, harsh conditions which the wave energy converters have to be designed to survive and during which we wouldn't be operating. So if we are looking at the ratio of extreme here, 10-year return period significant wave height to the average wave height, it really sort of acts as a proxy for a suitability of the site for wave energy harnessing. Ideally, we want low extremes and high mean conditions. And we see that along the north coast, it's really not suitable for wave energy harnessing because typically the conditions are small wave heights and occasionally they get hit by tropical cyclones. But everywhere else along the coastline, the ratio of extremes to the mean conditions is very favorable. Next slide, please. All right, and the final, I guess, aspect of the Australian wave climate that I'd like to touch on is persistence. What I mean by that along the south coast, the waves are effectively ever present. They're always present. So if we look at the map here, at the diagram here, it's the wave climate from Albany in Western Australia, but we think this is really representative of the whole Southern Ocean coastline, the Southern Australian coastline. So each condition across this 38 years of historical data is represented on this diagram. We've got period on the x-axis and wave height on the y-axis. The most common conditions are shown in warm colors. So in Albany, typical conditions are 2-meter waves, 11 seconds long. But what I would really like to point out is this white strip along the bottom of the graph. So wave conditions with wave heights less than 1 meter simply don't occur. The waves never drop below 1 meter, so that they're always there. And this really translates to the table that we've got on the left-hand side, which shows that virtually all the time, 99% of the time, we can guarantee wave energy flux above 10 kilowatts per meter. So just in summary, the Australian wave resource is enormous, is highly consistent and persistent with low extremes, which are all favorable for wave energy harnessing.
Thank you, Yana. You took my tagline away. We've got the best resource of any country in the world. So how can we integrate and benefit from this in our energy mix? We're going to introduce Peter Osman from CSIRO, who's going to really take us through some of the market opportunities and applications and integration into Australia's energy mix. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, and I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors who you've heard we'll be hearing from later, and CSIRO in the form of Jenny Hayward, who contributed much to this work, and Waveswell, who provided a lot of useful data. Next slide, please. It's become quite well known that combining wave, wind, and solar resources can improve the reliability of a renewable energy network. And this talk's going to show a method for quantifying that reliability and explore some avenues for assigning it a commercial value. Next slide, please. The work's based on the Australian Wave Energy Atlas and a method for quantifying the reliability of renewable energy, which was developed during the AUS10 Tidal Energy Program in 2020. And the method's been applied to a wave energy converter using a Waveswell power matrix in a collaboration between Waveswell and CSIRO. The model was set up at 3 hypothetical sites along the southern coast of Australia: Warrnambool, Cape Nelson, and Carpenter Rocks, shown here as the yellow dots. Next slide, please. Now, wave energy is at a very early stage of development compared to wind and solar. There are only about 3 or 4 units worldwide that have made comprehensive data public for multi-year operations connected to the grid. So when comparing the commercial CapEx, the capital expenditure learning curves for offshore wind and wave energy, as shown above, it takes a decade or 2 before they reach cost parity. That's about 2040 to 2025, where the 2 curves for wind and wave merge. That's if it's judged on a capital cost basis alone. But wave energy's got advantages that could improve this, including its potential for proximity to the shore, really important, high energy density, high capacity factor, and its reputation for reliability. And it's the reliability factor that will be explored here. Next slide, please. If the reliability of an intermittent generator, such as wave energy, could be well characterized, then it opens up at least 3 general opportunities: cost-effective energy security, the potential for participating in the national electricity market, and the potential for reducing the capital expenditure and the associated environmental impact for achieving dispatchable electricity production. Next slide, please. Traditionally, power generations relied on dispatchable generators, and this would include, for example, gas and some forms of coal and possibly even nuclear. Wind and solar energy generators have not really been regarded as dispatchable generators, They're intermittent and variable, even when coupled with a reasonable level of energy storage. But introducing wave energy has got the potential to change that. And to demonstrate this, I've used as a metric the ratio of the available power that can be guaranteed to the average power that is available over a required period of time. And by available power that can be guaranteed, I mean power that can be switched on or off at any time and at any level up to the maximum level guaranteed. And we talk about average power rather than rated power, as it better reflects the usable power that is available most of the time. In other words, the power that we can pay for. However, per megawatt, the capital expenditure for average power might appear more expensive than rated power. But that's because you're paying for what you get. The dispatchable to average power ratio, referred to here as a dispatchability threshold, and it allows comparisons of reliability for intermittent and variable renewable energy resources. And this helps us to calculate the minimum energy storage to achieve a specified dispatchability or reliability. Next slide, please. So, for example, if you look at these two renewable power time series, you can see that over approximately 1,500 days, they both have average values shown as horizontal red lines and dispatchable thresholds shown as horizontal yellow lines, which are set at about 0.5 of the average power. The top chart represents a standalone wind farm, and it's clear it's not meeting the dispatchability threshold. The power drops below the yellow line frequently. The bottom chart represents a hybrid wave wind and solar farm, and it's supported by energy storage. And the power this system provides is always greater than or equal to the dispatchability threshold. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows how to estimate the minimum battery capacity for a required dispatchability threshold and its impact on power availability from wave, wind, and solar energy resources. So first, we combined the time series for wave, wind, and solar resources into a single time series. We evaluated then the energy surpluses and deficits on either side of the dispatchability threshold, and then partitioned the series into minimal duration domains, each with net zero energy boundaries. And the required energy storage capacity is then the cumulative deficit for the domain with the greatest cumulative deficit. Now, I've given you an example of this in the top left-hand corner. The gray line dropping down and then up a little bit and then down again and then back to zero, that's the cumulative deficit. And the deepest drop is the greatest cumulative deficit. And in the whole set of those domains, the domain with the greatest cumulative deficit, that's the value for your battery energy storage. You can also obtain, using this method, forecasting trends from the durations, the cumulative deficits, the surpluses and their ratios. And power generation probability distributions can be derived. And these are most important when you're wanting to assess the reliability of a power system. The graph at the top right-hand side of the slide shows probability distributions with and without wave energy, but with no battery storage. And you can see a slight shift to the right in the blue bars that indicates the potential for improved reliability. But that doesn't really show up very distinctly until a battery is actually added. And in the bottom, you can see a battery has been added, and there's a very large spike, which shows the threshold above which energy is guaranteed. Next slide, please. Now here we look at the battery capacities, the size of the batteries required for various different combinations of hybrid wave, wind, and solar energy generators. And the impact of those hybrid groups, as I said before, becomes evident only when you start to put batteries in. And you see that as the dispatchability increases from 0 to about 0.7 or 8 here, that the different combinations of hybrid wave, wind, and solar energy generators start to diverge. So if we take the dispatchability of 0.7, which is very similar to the National Electricity Network threshold, then combining wave and wind requires a huge battery, massive, 240 megawatt hours per megawatt. By comparison, the next graph down, a wave and wind farm requires 2/3 of that capacity, and wave with solar or wave wind and solar require just 1/4 of that capacity. Next slide, please. This reduction in required battery capacity is reflected in the capital cost, which is dominated by energy storage. The capital cost in 2050 for a wave, wind, solar, and storage power system is about 1/4 of the cost for a solar, wind, and storage system that produces the same level of guaranteed power. And just using solar by itself is quite off the chart. It's far too expensive. Both solar and wind storage systems are just far too expensive. On the right-hand side, you can see a bar chart with horizontal bars, and this demonstrates that wave power gives the lowest cost for all dispatchability threshold values when it's included in a hybrid system. Next slide, please. A major reason for the capacity and cost reductions in the previous slide is that as the dispatchability threshold approaches 0.5, seasonal variations dominate the solar power intermittency and variability. For a long time, that seasonal variation in wave was thought to be a disadvantage, but in fact, its complementarity with solar makes it very much an advantage. The chart at the top left-hand side of the slide shows the seasonal solar power variation, and below it is the corresponding wave energy chart. Now, you can see the solar variation in the top very clearly. It's not at all evident in the wave power until you filter it. Once you filter it with the seasonal filter, the correlation of 0.26 changes to an inverse correlation of -0.67. So looking at the right-hand side, the blue seasonally varying line is wave energy, and at the bottom, the orange seasonally varying line is solar, and the two approximately cancel out, leaving noise in the green line, and that demonstrates the advantage. Now, this seasonal variation in wave energy has been noted at several other sites, notably Mutriku in the Bay of Biscay, Orkney, and the Western European Atlantic coastlines. And it accounts mainly for the improvement in dispatchability from combining wave energy with solar PV in the previous slide. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at a larger scale resource, this is the solar and wind renewable energy contribution for this year on the South Australian electricity network. And as you can see, it has significant intermittency, which is currently addressed by including coal, gas, hydropower, and distillate, which are largely imported from Victoria. Wave energy should be able to provide a complementary resource that reduces the need for fossil fuel, reduces energy wastage or curtailment, and the need for energy storage. And in England, for example, the Evolve Consortium calculates that introducing 10 gigawatts of wave energy could bring annual cost savings of £1.5 billion and annual CO2 reductions of about 1 million tonnes. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the AEMO, that's the Australian Electricity Marketing Organisation. It shows their integrated system plan between now and 2050 for transferring over to renewable energy. The benefits of wave energy potentially flow to the community through improved cost effectiveness, energy security, and minimizing environmental impact. So if you look at the integrated system plan, the vertical axis is the power capacity in gigawatts. The yellow and green bars indicate solar and wind power. The purple and blue bars indicate power storage capacity. The orange line is my estimate of the system average power, and the black line is AEMO's estimate of dispatchable power. And the capacity of solar and wind for the grid is projected to expand by a factor of 6 from now to 2050. 6 times as much solar and wind has to be installed. And the average capacity of the total supply for that will increase by approximately 2. So that's a factor of 3 overbuild to improve dispatchability. Nevertheless, the dispatchability is degrading, will degrade from 1 in 2009 to 0.8 at present, and down to 0.6 by 2050. And this is proposed to be managed using methods such as voluntary load coordination, that is controlling things like household solar energy storage and vehicle battery charging. And there's a very sophisticated control system that's being put in place by AEMO that will allow this to be done. By 2050, however, the plan still requires about 9 gigawatts of flexible gas that could be either renewable or fossil fuel based. And day-to-day storage is based on just 12-hour storage duration batteries. To quote AEMO, managing seasonality and droughts will depend on pumped hydro development, but will also require deep storage solutions to evolve. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there. Now, wave energy can provide some alternative solutions or additional solutions. It can convert intermittent capacity to guaranteed power, as you can see in section A, the double arrow on the right-hand side of the chart. It can reduce energy storage costs, as shown in section B, just underneath section A on the right-hand side. And it can reduce possibly up to ×3 the capital cost and environmental impact of a 6 times increase in wind and solar shown in segment C. So to summarize, the potential, next slide please. The potential value of wave, solar and wind hybrids to a national electricity system is going to be the reduced cost of energy storage, the reduced need for curtailment, and I don't know if you know, but in New South Wales, there was a significant requirement for curtailment yesterday. Imagine what it'll be like when we've got 6 times as much. Reduced cost and environmental impact of wind and solar farms, and the ability to bid with significantly higher dispatch values in the national electricity markets, the spot markets and other contracts. Now, if all of this is to be achieved, there'll be we have to discuss all of this with AEMO. What, for example, is required to persuade them that wave energy should be included in the NEM integrated system plan? I mean, that's a major barrier to cross because they are on a critical path to try and achieve complete renewable energy by 2050, and that's no mean feat. What would be required if we succeed in persuading them that wave energy can be included in the way of energy forecasts? So solar and wind, all of them now are associated with regular, reliable energy forecasting, and wave energy providers will need to have very reliable wave energy forecasts as well. And then finally, how do we assure that AEMO classifications and scheduling don't compromise the benefits of wave energy, benefits of the integrated service provider's energy resource complementarity? That should be of great commercial value to a generator, but that could be destroyed if wave energy is inadvertently switched off when it's most needed. So the scheduling, the way in which power generators are switched on and off needs to be negotiated quite carefully. Now, finally, a target that I think at least might persuade AEMO to include wave power in their 2050 planning could be a high power, that is a 1 megawatt average power, not rated power, average power, wave energy converter connected to the grid and installed, this is the most important, installed in ocean waters that are sufficiently active to be commercially viable. Now, that hasn't been done anywhere in the world, and we've got the best wave energy resource to achieve that. There are plenty of commercially viable sites in Australia. There's been quite a few demonstrators around the world and in Australia that have shown commercial potential. How do we encourage them to stay in Australia and work in Australia? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's great. So we've got a very reliable resource. It's complementary with wind and solar. It helps improve the dispatchability of our energy. and it reduces the need and the cost of storage. I'm now going to invite Natalia Sergienko from the University of Adelaide, who's going to really take us through a number of potential applications for wave energy, including co-location with other renewables, decarbonisation opportunities from wave energy for marine industries, and also coastal resilience. So I welcome Natalia.
Thank you, Irene. I will be covering sections of chapter 4, which was written by Richard Manassa and myself with the help of Hugh Wolgamott. Next slide, please. So the first opportunity that wave energy can bring is a co-location with offshore wind, and the benefits for both systems. So they are offshore industries and they are renewable energy plants, and they can share costs associated with site licensing, installation, operation, maintenance, supply chain, and many others. Wave Energy Scotland conducted an exhaustive study investigating 17 different scenarios of co-locating wind and wave energy plants with different levels of integration. So from site sharing or just installation on a common platform. And they found that regardless of the level of integration, all scenarios led to a significant cost reduction for both wind and wave energy technologies. Similar study was done in Australia, and it showed that up to 14% cost reduction can be achieved across 7 out of 8 deployment sites if offshore wind is complemented with wave energy converters. Next slide, please. And the next opportunity for wave energy is the co-location of wave energy converters with offshore aquaculture can supply reliable and renewable power for its operations. So according to numerous studies, wave energy converters co-located with aqua farms can power up to 100% of their operations. And in Australia, it was a feasibility study done by Australian Ocean Energy Group. And when they investigated whether wave energy converters how adding wave energy converters to the existing Abalone farm in Victoria can benefit the aquaculture microgrid, and they found that the potential reduce of carbon dioxide by 94% due to the addition of wave energy converters. Next slide. Also, Australia is a quite unique country, I would say, because it's because of its size. We have 500,000 people not connected to the grid, and we have many populated islands that use diesel generators to power their homes. So in Australia, wave energy already has a levelized cost of energy competitive with diesel generation in remote locations. And one of such examples is King Island in Tasmania. And the study was done, not the study, actually, it was a trial. Waveswell Energy was deployed their wave energy converter and integrated it into the high penetration microgrid. And they found that the adding wave energy to the microgrid reduced diesel consumption by 3,300 liters. Next slide. Of course, there are many circumstances where wave energy is damaging for natural and human assets like beaches, cliffs. It can lead to flooding, port and harbor sloshing. And it's estimated that about 10% of Australian coastal assets are under substantial risk due to high waves in Australia. Next slide, please. And by the definition, actually, wave energy converters, they are designed to remove energy from waves in order to convert that energy into useful form of electricity. So we can use wave energy converter arrays or farms to reduce the waves and reduce coastal hazards. And what's the main benefit of using wave energy converters as opposed to sea walls is that they can be controlled. So we can control which waves go to the beach and which waves can be blocked. Also, we can optimize arrangement of the wave farms in such so that we can reduce the erosion But at the same time, those wave energy converter arrays will be generating power for local communities. So overall, co-location of wave energy with offshore industries and coastal communities can bring substantial benefits to the Australian economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. That's excellent. I'm going to invite now Wicky Ebling, who's going to tell us a little bit more about helping develop the industry in Australia. Welcome, Wicky.
Thank you, Irene, and thanks, Leslie, for driving the slide pack. So thank you for my contributing authors here too, and for the chapter reviewer. So this chapter dives into, we know about the resource now, we know somewhat Australia should do it, but could we do it? So this is now the question of the workforce and the industry behind it. Next slide, please. So we have a huge mismatch generally, as I said, like we have the resource in terms of the natural resource. Now looking at the workforce, this is really hard to quantify because not a single business would actually label themselves as the supply chain for marine offshore energy. And now this is different in the world where some government-driven programs really encourage activity in the marine energy space. But globally, still, this is very small numbers. But as we know, like if there's this forecast of 100 gigawatts of installed capacity just for marine energy, obviously that should transpire through to a jobs growth as well. And an example that illustrates that quite beautifully and also taps into a remote workforce that I've used in this chapter here is the European Marine Energy Centre in Scotland, where they can really, over these last 20 years, quantify how much reinvestment actually happened in the Orkney Islands through a policy-driven concerted effort into the marine energy in those regions where there is actually a genuine supply chain now across operations. Next slide, please. So if you look then at sort of the Australian landscape, as I said, we don't have a single business who would actually, define themselves as the supply chain for marine energy, but we have a qualified workforce that will have to transition anyway because they are like ceasing operations or a qualified workforce in operations that are immediately transitionable. If you think of offshore oil and gas, which obviously has been a stronghold for Western Australia in particular, but Australia generally. Now, looking at all the states, which one has committed to marine energy? Well, literally just one has mentioned it in their sustainability or in their net zero plans. Victoria and WA, that is Victoria. Victoria and WA have great synergies in their resource, as Jana was saying too, along the south coast really, but also a strong history in those offshore operations and budding offshore wind developments. So there's trends that converge, and there's also operations and business discussions happening at sort of port level, for example, supply chain businesses to capitalize on those different qualities. Hydrogen, everyone loves hydrogen, could be an enabler or sort of vice versa. So the everyone loves hydrogen might actually lead for wave energy being tied in with the rise of renewable hydrogen to be seen, but hydrogen makes much more an appearance in any of these net zero plans than wave energy does. It might just be just like offshore wind, something where wave energy can be tied into. Next slide, please. So looking at what Australia has done and currently is doing, so there are a couple of case studies, and that's sort of where my contributing authors have been very helpful in really informing me on how much have we tapped into the Australian workforce and how much has each individual project, for example, added additional value. So Australia is good in the sense that we have test facilities for the pre-commercial stages. So research support is there, including within the Blue Economy CRC membership. So we're tracking well in that regard, and obviously we've done it for decades in the offshore oil and gas context, but we're not quite equipped for those full-scale testing that goes into the commercial realm, and that is also where a lot of businesses making the hard decision to move overseas, not just for the funding, but also for tapping into those facilities, for example. And that is a huge risk. So we know we have the natural resource, we know we have businesses that and a workforce that should be readily accessible. So let's keep them here. The way we have started tapping into that workforce and shown that there could be a supply chain, there is that quality of the workforce, is highlighted in these 3 case studies. So Carnegie's Perth Wave Energy Project in 2012, Waveswell's King Island project from 2019, and then our own, so the UWA project on the Albany M4 Wave Energy Converter, which is currently happening, as Irene was saying. So all of these 3 projects have used the local workforce. So this is partly because all of them received state government funding, and state governments feel quite strongly that money should be reinvested into their economies. Fair enough. But that also means that for procurement purposes, there was advantage given in the procurement ranking to local/regional businesses. So for example, Carnegie used graduate engineers, so there was a training opportunity. Waveswell upskilled local concrete fabricators, for example. And for our M4 Wave Energy project, we upskilled welding qualifications, for example, local welders. So none of these businesses would ever have said like, oh, we're in the business of wave energy, but they were all able to fill a gap in the procurement chain. So I believe we can do it. That's sort of the upshot of the chapter. But obviously more incentive has to be given that actually gives them more certainty that they can keep being involved in these operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivki. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. So we've got a significant opportunity to support both research and development and workforce development for wave energy in Australia, which is an excellent story to be able to tell. And we're already on that journey, but we'd like to do more. I'd like to invite our next speaker, Rowan Trebelko from CSIRO. Rowan's actually going to take us through some of the knowledge that we've actually developed around environmental effects and impacts from wave energy converters. Good afternoon, Rowan, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Irene, and thanks everyone for joining. So yeah, I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors and contributing authors listed here, and also I'd like to acknowledge Louise Sinnott, who was our expert chapter reviewer and was very helpful. Next slide, thanks, Irene. Okay, my slide has been broken up over several slides, so we'll figure this out as we go. I thought I only had 1 slide. So I guess because of the nascent state of marine renewable energy in Australia, the actual realised environmental impacts of current wave energy developments are really limited and highly localised within Australia currently. But because, as we've heard, the sector is expanding rapidly and there's great potential, the potential environmental impacts associated with the sector, and particularly with large-scale developments, will require careful consideration and regulation and management. And so in our chapter, we reviewed information that's available from the limited developments that have happened to date in Australia. And then we also drew on the growing body of literature from the US and Europe that we can draw on for understanding of the likely environmental impacts of wave energy development in the Australian context. Even in that global context, though, long-term data sets are limited due to the reasonably early stages of development of the technology and deployment, and particularly of the larger scale arrays. I think we can go on to my next slide. It's a bit hard to know given it's been... Okay, this is the slide I was expecting. So the main impact pathways that represent risks to the environment are illustrated in the figure on the right-hand side here. So just running around them in a clockwise fashion from the top. So pollution and debris, impacts on fauna, including avoidance, displacement, potentially attraction, so things like artificial reef effects, potentially habitat loss due to things like scour of bottom contacting infrastructure, electromagnetic fields associated with transmission lines, noise, entanglement with lines associated with infrastructure, potentially change of behaviour, including predation and foraging, and changes in oceanography due to the capture of energy and the removal from the oceanographic processes, and finally changes to sedimentation onshore and impacts from onshore infrastructure. And for all of these, the current state of the knowledge indicates that the realised impacts and risks are low. But the understanding of the potential impacts of the deployments is based, again, on limited knowledge, and particularly at the ecosystem and community level. So we identified key uncertainty and research needs going forward, which are particularly the implications of arrays and the potential for cumulative effects. Implications on warmer water ecosystems are also an uncertainty, given most of what's happened has been in cold and temperate ecosystems. And the recommendations that we put forward out of all that were the need for strategic site selection and temporal restrictions, simple one of ensuring that any lines associated with infrastructure are taut, so there's no loose line that can present a risk for entanglement of wildlife. And then this comes back to something that Hugh said right at the start, the need for baselines, monitoring, and adaptive management approaches where you're learning as you go from that baseline and monitoring information. And a key, the link to Hugh's slide there was the need for data sharing and open data and incentives to enable that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rowan. And, you know, just to that effect, in terms of what you've presented, we're very fortunate that we've got an international body through the International Energy Agency, Ocean Energy Systems, that's been doing quite a lot of work as part of OES Environmental to help de-risk the developments around ocean energy through valuable data that developers have been contributing to an international database to help de-risk future ocean energy projects, but also kind of reduce some of the myths associated with the environmental impacts that people might perceive are associated with wave energy as well. So I think it's been an excellent body of work, and we really thank those who contributed to this chapter. I'm going to invite now Philip Marsh from the Australian Maritime College, University of Tasmania, who's really looked at the chapter around planning for wave energy developments, looking at the different multi-jurisdictional planning frameworks and regulatory requirements for ocean energy projects. So welcome, Phil. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Irene. So next slide. So today it's just a quick overview on our chapter about planning for wave energy devices in Australia. Quick thanks to Chris Frid from Griffith University for his contribution to this work. So as you can see, in Australia, we've got a unique planning environment. It's covered by legislation across 3 separate jurisdictions that you can see here. So we've got Commonwealth waters, more than 3 nautical miles from the coastline. We've also got those state waters between the land and the Commonwealth waters, and local council areas. These are mostly on land. So any proposed wave energy device must meet the requirements of the space that it occupies. So for example, if we put one in Bass Strait, if it's in the middle of the strait, it may require permitting over 3 separate jurisdictions. So the wave energy device might be in Commonwealth waters, so it'll have to meet Commonwealth needs. The transmission infrastructure, however, will be in Commonwealth and state waters, so it'll have to meet Commonwealth and state coastal water needs. And the onshore infrastructure will be on land, so it might have to meet local council needs. So you can see, depending on the location of the wave energy device, they've got to meet a series of really complex and multi-jurisdictional requirements. So to date, no known energy devices have been placed in Commonwealth waters, wave energy devices. That's probably a result of the early TRL, the development stage. But as these technologies advance, they're going to be looking to move further offshore to access high energy environments. And these are often located in Commonwealth waters. So next slide, please. So in Commonwealth waters, considerable effort's been placed on developing legislation recently. So we've got the release of the Offshore Energy Infrastructure Act 2021 and the Declaration of Areas around Australia, which you can see in that figure. So these areas are heavily focused on offshore wind developments, as they are more advanced than wave at the moment. However, these same regions can be used for wave energy devices, and also the legislation can be used for wave energy. So the pathway is there for this industry. They've also formulated a pathway for research and development licenses. To date, this hasn't actually been used. They've only granted feasibility licenses for offshore wind, but the process is there. So any wave energy developers looking for Commonwealth waters now have a process that they can follow. So there's another, excuse me. So along the IOEI Act, there's also numerous other acts, Commonwealth acts that proponents must meet. So you've got things like the EPBC Act, Fisheries Management Act, Underwater Cultural Act, and there's a whole host of other ones that are listed in the paper. There's also key international agreements such as Ramsar. We've got some whaling agreements and numerous migrating bird agreements. So you're going to have to meet all of these requirements if you want to put a wave energy device out there. On top of that, though, if you're looking at state or local council regulations, you've got to meet a whole host of local regulations. So, for example, in Tasmania, we've got Aboriginal Heritage Acts, Waterways and Water Code Acts, amongst others. So there's a whole heap of legislation that you do need to meet. So all this is possible, however, which is the good news, I guess. So we do have all these 3 jurisdictions, but we have had projects get up. So things like M4, More Power, Waveswell, they've successfully gained approval in local council and state waters. But you can see there the pathways are pretty complex and costly, and they could definitely be streamlined using processes such as marine spatial planning. So we just hit next slide. So a really quick summary, planning covers 3 separate but linked jurisdictions. The regulations could certainly be enhanced by more integrated and streamlined processes. Provisions of guidance documents, such as that provided by the Commonwealth DQ for offshore wind, would also increase the success of projects. So it'd be good to push for some specific to wave energy guidance. Data sharing is always great. So across jurisdictions, regions, and even industries, in particular offshore wind, would reduce the overall development costs. We could spread the financing costs across multiple projects, hence reducing the financial risk that we face. And as I said, estate management frameworks may be a really good pathway forward for ocean energy. And we're actually progressing a program on marine spatial planning through the Blue Economy CRC. So I hope that gives you a really quick overview of what is quite a complex planning space for wave energy in Australia. But as I said, there are projects in the water, so it is possible. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Phil, for taking us through that very complex framework that we have for offshore renewables in Australia. So I'm going to now invite Hugh Breakey from Griffith University, because he's going to probably take us through, some knowledge around whether there's widespread support for offshore renewable energy developments, including wave energy, and, what is the community's perception and what do they want to know about it? So I want to welcome Hugh Breakey as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Irene. G'day, everyone. So the work I'll be talking about is the work on ethics and social acceptability, which is one part of Chapter 6. And I did this work with a couple of my colleagues at the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law at Griffith University. So that's Laurel Bossy and Professor Charles Sanford, and also with contribution from Alea Spencer-Cotton from University of WA. Next slide, please. So a few things, sort of main takeaways from our section, and perhaps the biggest one and the most important one to underline is that widespread social support for renewable energy as a general matter does not necessarily translate into local community acceptance of new developments. Well, how do we know that? We know that because it's happened consistently in lots of overseas jurisdictions. We also know it because it's happened in Australia for offshore wind. So the amount of people who are in favour of renewable energy as a general proposition, it's very, very high in Australia. But what we've seen is a lot of worries, a lot of resistance once we've had actual particular proposals for particular zones and bringing the local community on board with them. Now, why has that happened? Does it mean Australia is populated with lots and lots of morally objectionable NIMBYs? It absolutely does not mean that. There are plenty of reasons why a community might have a lot of support for renewable energy as a general matter, but might have particular concerns about the reasons why it wouldn't be a good fit for their local community, why it wouldn't be the best way to go forward in terms of renewable energy transition. Doesn't necessarily mean that the best way to do that is with offshore wind in their particular area. Why might they have worries about that? If we go on to that if we see that second point there, things like community acceptance and social license to operate. Sometimes the reasons for these are not very surprising. They often respond to very standard and predictable notions of, is the operation legitimate and is it morally acceptable? And that's going to turn on concerns of fairness. Are there other users who are wanting to use those waterways and they have established practices and they think it's unfair if they are denied them, perhaps without compensation? Are the things that are going in the water, are they environmentally sustainable? Are they going to upset perhaps local ecologies that are really, really important, so important that it would be worth protecting them, even if there is a cost to sort of the overall environmental benefits of our climate response? Harm prevention and things like that. So some very standard ones and very predictable ones. There are also some unpredictable ones, and that's where we talk about things like place attachment, the community's understanding of and their felt relationship with their locality, how they identify with it, how they think of the waters around them and thinking about themselves as coastal people who love to be at the beach, who love to be looking out on those open horizons. That might impact on the different types of technology devices that we might want to put into the water. And that's something we've just got to learn from communities about and talk to them about, because that isn't an easy one to predict. So let me just give you a few of our recommendations. Number one, community engagement should start early. It must be part of an overall plan that aligns engagement with the decisions being made at each juncture. That hasn't been done well with offshore wind. It needs to be done better in the future. Trustworthy, independent, accessible research and monitoring are really, really important. Perhaps one takeaway is it's a good idea to start soon and let communities start to watch what's happening and get familiar with these technologies so that they can make an informed decision about the way that they want to go with these. All right, that's all from me. Hand back to you now, Irene. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hugh. I'm now going to introduce Pethy Lyons, who's going to from CSIRO, who's going to talk to us about the importance of actually partnering with our Indigenous communities in wave energy developments. Good afternoon, Pethy. Thank you for joining us. Just checking that Pethy Lyons is still with us online. We can't hear you, Pethy. Is your microphone on mute? It doesn't look like Pethy is there. She's struggling to join us. Hugh, would you like to continue?
Yeah, you bet, no problem. So this is the work that was done on cultural license to operate, and so the distinction there between social license and cultural license is that social license is particularly focused on the First Nations people, and this work was done by Pethy at CSIRO, and I think it was Jess at CSIRO as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. And so the main difference here is that the Indigenous people should be treated as right holders, not as stakeholders. So, all of those people that I was talking about in the discussion on social license, they all deserve consideration as stakeholders, but they may not be appropriately treated as rights holders. So they may not actually hold a legal and strong connection to the land as First Nations peoples would, particularly under international law and the treaties that support them, and their capacity to have free, prior and informed consent over developments that affect them. So that's why we sort of talk about cultural license differently to social license. It's sort of an additional and larger and more weighty thing. And perhaps the most important thing to emphasise is that those offshore landscapes and submerged landscapes can be very culturally important to Indigenous people with notions of sea country, etc. And Therefore, the traditions and attachments that they have to those places, just like to places on land that are sacred to them, need to be protected in the same ways. So key cultural license to operate principles here, and of course the Blue Economy CRC has a terrific project on this. The report's available online. If you just Google cultural license to operate and Blue Economy, you will get it. And the key principles there include looking after and taking on board their social cultural knowledge that they have, often through their long custodianship of these places, their custodian relationship with the land and the sea, and the importance of participation as distinguished from consultation. And so the distinction there, you can consult somebody, but you don't necessarily have to include them in your decision making. To include them as partners in decision making is what we talk about as being participation, and this is sort of more important again in the context of First Nations people as opposed to just normal social license and ordinary stakeholders. So the key recommendations here are that wave energy projects can offer some real positives here. There can be great opportunities for new partnerships, and they can be a great way forward, especially if you think of the possibilities for remote communities, remote coastal communities, but potentially getting really good energy sources instead of using diesel, etc. And then also partnership pathways. And the key here is long-term relationships, meaningful consultation, negotiation, and dialogue. So it's not short, it's not transactional, it won't happen quickly. The important thing is to go in and build those relationships and go from there. Thanks, Irene.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I'll just see if Pethy Lyons can hear us now and can jump in on her presentation in case she'd like to add anything. Pethy, can you hear me now? Unfortunately, we can't grab Pethy Lyons, but we'll see if she can join the Q&A. But we all agree that there are significant opportunities to working with our Indigenous communities, in particular in remote areas and coastal communities where energy security is a critical issue. And it's also an opportunity to help develop their communities, their jobs, their industry, so they can be self-reliant as well. And I think this applies to a lot of remote communities, in fact. But I do agree that it's an excellent opportunity in this particular space, and they have a lot of cultural knowledge they can bring actually into these developments, understanding their coastal areas and the dynamics of those areas really well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to the next slide and just as a mention to say that you can download the full report from the Blue Economy CRC's website. And, you know, I really appreciate there's been so many contributing authors, experts, to this report, and they're all listed and acknowledged in the report. So we really recommend that you download that report if you can from our website and have a good read and come back to us at any time if you've got questions. I'm just going to now move down to, if I can, I'm going to invite Jana and Hugh Wolgamott from the University of Western Australia and take an opportunity to invite them to actually lead a Q&A discussion for the remaining time. We've got about 10 minutes before we actually do the Q&A and have to finish the webinar. And I can see Pethy Lyons is on now. We can see her. Hopefully we can hear her part of the Q&A. So please do not hesitate to ask us some questions. So Jana and Hugh, thank you. I'm going to hand the Q&A over to you. And just very quickly, maybe you can invite Pethy, if she can hear us, to say a few words about the importance of the cultural engagement with projects as well.
Yep, that's a great idea, Irene. Pethy, are you able to give us some comments on that now?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, fantastic. I did hear Hugh. Thank you so much, Hugh. The main, for me, the main thing here is that time begins for the cultural license to operate. Time begins many years ago, many thousands of years ago. So it's really centered on First Nations peoples being occupants of their territories and states, bringing holistic rights, interests, and values to their ancestral lands and waters. So First Nations peoples understand their positions to be different to existing and prior to stakeholders. And the other there is the customary estate is continued continuous includes submerged to terrestrial. And so that these different perspectives of time, but also space, can bring up this risk of, or introduce a new risk of a new regime of renewable energies and offshore renewable energies as a new regime of occupation of customary territories, seas and coastlines that's unseen beyond European colonisation. So what Hugh had mentioned, the partnerships approach is really critical, and Indigenous peoples have bring a particular lens for country and partnership pathways based on each group's relationship to country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bethy. Yep, glad you could make it online. Just to pick up some of the questions in the chat quickly, Hugh, since you're still there, I'll throw one question to you. So Glenn's asking a question about offshore game fishing, and that they have concerns about offshore wind, which are many and varied, but mainly around lockouts and potential for environmental damage, and asking how might wave energy differ?
Yeah, great question, Glenn. It's a complex question, or the answer to it's complex, and it's for a couple of reasons. So environmentally, it is a different sort of risk profile that's being presented by wave. And some of that is not really well known at that point, and at this point, and other bits are, but the environmental impacts of, for example, large commercial arrays of wave is something that we're still finding out about. I'll focus on the social stuff rather than environmental stuff, because Rowan would do that better than me. But in terms of the lockout, so a lot of things will depend on what type of technology is it, because there are a number of very different wave energy devices that can all harness the energy in the wave in different ways, and some of them might be very small and very concentrated, and so wouldn't be as much of an issue from your perspective. And others are, for example, some are entirely underwater, and so that might mean that there wasn't a necessity for lockouts, etc. But the takeaway is it would be technologically dependent, like what is the type of device, the wave energy converter that they're putting in the water, and does that involve lockouts, etc. And the other one would be, what's the function of that? If it's a small device, for example, or set of devices that's being used to stop aggressive wave flow at beaches, that's probably not going to be a problem to you. If it's a set of small devices that are powering a remote island community, so they don't have to use diesel, I would suspect that's not a problem for you either. But maybe large-scale ones that are commercially operating in large pieces of sea would be. Even then, there might be a consideration. We talked about co-location. Is it replacing some of the wind stuff? So if you use wind and wave together, are you taking up less ocean, and therefore that's more desirable from a fishing perspective? So anyway, there's a lot of complexities here, and it may be that there's a bunch of wave technologies and functions that won't be problematic from your perspective, but others that you will want to look into. Thanks, Glenn. Cheers.
Thanks very much for answering that, Hugh. All right, I'll pick another question from the list. This one is from an anonymous attendee. Maybe I'll address it to Adi. So the question is, given the reliability of the resource, why has there been so little investment by industry? I wondered whether you could share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is a question I like to ask myself. I mean, if I'm in their shoes, why would I invest in wave energy? So I guess the industry would like to see more devices trialed in the water and succeed. And I think part of the problem here is that most wave energy developers are small companies. And given that wave energy is a relatively new technology, when a failure hits, which could be some minor thing, but have major consequences, it's hard for them to recover. And this failure might not imply that the technology itself is flawed, but yeah, it could be things that were overlooked, given it's a new type of operations, but it's all part of the learning process. But yeah, the impact to that small company can be disastrous. But I mean, internationally, we are trying to improve on this. So like putting stages in development so that we can de-risk the whole development process and try to document everything that we learn along the way. So I think that's my view on this.
Yep, thanks, Addy. I mean, just to add quickly on that, I mean, I think there's also the question of not just industry funding, but of funding from governments. And I guess the issue is maybe not the lack of funding, but it's patchiness over time. And I think one of the things that we're trying to establish now is this strategic view, and the IEA OES report really maps that out, that consistency of funding across time and across the world will be key. So another question is for Peter Osman. So Peter, there was a question about making predictions out to 2050 and how cost reductions estimated. So solar and storage both have continued cost declines forecast. And so how does this influence predictions about wave energy?
All the projections and the learning curves that I presented, they're all based on GenCost, which is a study carried out by CSIRO every year, updated every year in consultation with various industries that supply the appropriate equipment. That's the basis for those projections that I used. By the way, some of the projections happen to coincide very closely with some data that we also had from WaveSwell, but they were, in fact, all based on GenCost.
Yep, Peter, while you're on, there's another question directed towards you about hybrid wave generation with other types of renewables. And the question's around, do you think it's better to focus on one type of hybrid system or to put the benefits of wave energy out there as being applicable to many hybrid systems with the risk of sort of diluting the focus?
I think it's, well, I think that if you want to look at developing the industry, traditionally it's started small and grown big. So solar, for example, a lot of that started and was sponsored in the Northern Territory with indigenous communities, for example. So I wouldn't want to suppress either. I would think both small projects leading to larger ones is likely to be the way to go. But AEMO are going to be running into significant issues in 10 or 15 years' time when they come to have to replace energy storage and batteries. And we should be cognizant of that as an opportunity, which we may lose if we're not ready for it in 10 years, because something else will fill the bill. So I would say we need both. We need the small projects and we need the large projects. We need one or two large projects to gain credibility with AEMO, who are the biggest customer that we're likely to have. And we need small projects because those are the ones that inevitably get the ball rolling. That's the track record. As for the modality, well, solar and wind seem to be dominating in both small area projects and in large projects. So I suspect that those are the ones to focus on, the modalities to focus on. But that might be in projects such as Natalie had described, or they might be in projects such as the one I've described for AEMO.
Yep, thanks, Peter. So thanks to everyone very much, and we'll throw it back to Irene to sum up. Thanks, Irene, for the opportunity.
No, look, thank you very much to all of the speakers today and all of the questions that were raised. We hope that you can reach out to us if you've got still questions that we can answer. Very happy to put you in touch with the experts that are on this call and the people that have contributed to the knowledge that's inside the report. And obviously we are very committed and very excited by wave energy, and we are here to help see it be a successful sector in Australia. And we've got a couple excellent projects that we're keeping our eyes on right now, things in the water now that are exciting, and including the M4 wave energy device that's deployed in Albany in the King George Sound. And it's projects like that that are helping build the social license and the acceptability around wave energy, but also bringing the knowledge to the forefront for people who may not have that knowledge around wave energy, and where wave energy can play a very significant role amongst other renewables, but also for our communities, for workforce development, for our partnerships with other industries as well. So I really want to take the opportunity to thank everyone for your contributions today. For those who are interested, again, the report is on the Blue Economy CRC's website, and it is also on the page where the webinar was advertised. When we end this today, we will be making the recording available. It should be there from sometime tomorrow, once we've had a chance to just edit it and place it online, so you can have a copy of this recording of this webinar as well. And if I can just thank everybody for joining this today, thank all my speakers today, and let you know that this was the last webinar for 2024. So you'll have to kind of go away and enjoy your Christmas holidays and the festive season in the summer. Keep an eye on that Wave Energy Converter in Western Australia, and then come back in the new year to hear all about some of those developments in a future webinar as well. So I wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and thank you very much for joining us this year.